There's a certain kind of silence that only a country morning can offer, still, wide, and honest. That morning, I remember the sun hadn't yet climbed fully over the ridge behind my barn. The mist was low over the pasture, clinging to the grass like it didn't want to let go. Birds chirped in a distant, measured rhythm, and my boots crunched softly on gravel as I made my way to check the water line near the north fence line. Just another morning on the farm. I'd lived here for 17 years. Before that, I served 22 in the Army infantry, then logistics, then I finally made it out. After the war and the noise, I didn't want cities. I wanted land, space. I bought this spread when my wife Nora was still alive. She picked out the trees that lined the driveway. Now they're tall enough to touch the morning sky. She passed 8 years ago, but this farm still beats with her fingerprints. We didn't have children, just the animals and the land. I'd grown fond of the bulls, especially Buck and Diesel, the two dominant ones in the southern paddock. They were massive, powerful animals, but I'd raised them by hand, gentle with me. But territorial, very territorial. That morning, I noticed Diesel was already agitated, snorting, pacing. I figured maybe it was the coyotes again, or a wildcat. But then I heard the tires, not the gravel from my drive. Not a visitor using the gate code. These were tires on grass. I stepped away from the fence line and narrowed my eyes toward the tree line at the far south end of the property, the part closest to the suburban development that had sprung up over the last decade. It used to be all woods and open field. Now cookie-cutter homes with beige vinyl siding and an HOA that thought they ruled the county. That's when I saw it. A white SUV gleaming and brand new, creeping along the old service path that cuts through the easement, an easement that runs entirely on my side of the property. The vehicle had no right to be there. The HOA had tried for years to claim they had some right to enforce visual standards on my fences, on my storage barn, even once on my livestock. Laughable. Considering I'm zoned agricultural and have full documentation exempting me from their reach. But that never stopped them from trying. The SUV stopped. The door opened. Out stepped a woman I'd come to recognize too well. Shoulder-length, platinum blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. Karen. She didn't even close the car door. Just started walking right through the misty field like she was surveying her backyard. I sighed. I pulled my phone out and hit record, holding it low but steady. Years of dealing with this board had taught me one thing: document everything. They lied, boldly. And they counted on people being too polite, too unsure, too uninformed to fight back. I walked toward the fence that divided the central path from the southern pasture. Karen had already stepped over the posted private property. No trespassing sign mounted clearly on the timber gate. It was big, red, reflective. No way she didn't see it. I raised my voice as I approached, not yelling, just clear, calm. The Army had taught me how to command attention with stillness. "You're on private land, ma'am," I called. She turned. "Mr. Lawton," she said with a smile that wasn't really a smile. "I'm just doing a routine compliance sweep. No need to get worked up. Compliance with what I asked. The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction here." She waved her clipboard like a priest blessing a demon. "There have been complaints about the condition of your south fence. Some residents reported livestock noises at all hours and concerns about sanitation." I almost laughed. It's a working farm. This entire subdivision is under Covenant Block 11. Per that, all properties within 500 feet of the primary perimeter fall under visual standards. "Your fencing?" "No, ma'am," I said, walking slowly toward the line. That clause was invalidated when the parcel split happened in 2009. My land is grandfathered in and outside HOA control. I've had that confirmed by the county, twice. She smiled wider, the fake kind that women like her seem to think could mask contempt. "Well, it's possible the documents have changed recently." I stopped at the gate and gestured to the bold lettering beside me. "And even if they had, this is trespassing. You're on private property. You need to leave." She turned to look at her SUV, then back at me. "I'll be filing a report. You're becoming aggressive. That animal noise this morning, I could hear it from my kitchen window." "You moved next to a farm," I said flatly. "The bulls aren't ornamental." With that, she huffed, turned on her expensive heels, and walked back to her SUV. I didn't say another word, but I kept the video running. And I caught it all, her ignoring the sign, stepping onto my land, claiming authority she didn't have. I had no idea then how important that little clip would become. She pulled her car out the same way she came in, tires rutting my pasture and scattering the dew. My bulls watched from behind the reinforced fence, ears flicking, tails twitching. Diesel snorted again, harder this time. He didn't like her scent, I could tell. I didn't either. But I didn't know this was just the start. The next morning started almost exactly like the last sun, breaking slow over the ridge mist, settling like an old friend, and the scent of dew and livestock drifting up through the barn doors. Diesel was calmer today, chewing his cud peacefully beside Buck, but I couldn't shake the tension I carried from yesterday's encounter. I'd dealt with that HOA plenty over the years. They'd sent letters, threats, even tried to fine me once for unauthorized structures when I put in a tool shed 15 feet from their imaginary line. But this time was different. Karen had physically entered my land. That was a line they'd never crossed before. I had already saved the footage from my phone to an external hard drive. 2 copies actually, one in the house and one in the old Army footlocker buried under feed bags in the barn. Experience teaches you that evidence is like water. During a fire, you better have it ready before things get hot. Around 9, I was hosing down the loading bay when I heard tires again. Not on gravel. Again on grass. I stood up straight, letting the hose hang slack in my hand. The dogs hadn't barked, which meant the vehicle had come in through the service path again, same as before. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked around the corner of the barn. There she was. Karen in the same white SUV, but this time, she wasn't alone. A man in khakis and a golf shirt climbed out of the passenger side, late 40s red HOA lanyard around his neck, clipboard matching hers. And a third person stepped out from the back seat, a woman holding a long measuring tape and what looked like a digital camera. They walked right through the gate again. No knock, no call, no respect. I didn't move yet. I wanted to see where they were going. Karen led them along the side fence, pointing toward the corner where the property dipped slightly downhill. That corner had always held water after rain. In fact, I'd installed extra drainage tiles there 5 years back. I walked slowly, not rushing, letting my presence be felt. As I approached, the man with the clipboard noticed me first. He looked uncomfortable. Karen, on the other hand, didn't flinch. "Mr. Lawton," she said brightly. "Glad you're here. We're conducting a preliminary inspection of your fence perimeter. Several reports came in after our community walkabout last month. Concerns regarding structure visual degradation and potential impact on surrounding property values." I said nothing. The woman with the measuring tape stepped back a bit, clearly unsure whether to keep going. "You're trespassing," I said, voice steady. Karen blinked, tilted her head. Actually, she said, per the shared easement guidelines filed with the county under Article 7, Section B, we're allowed a 3-foot survey offset for safety compliance. I raised an eyebrow. That guideline applies to shared HOA green spaces, not private agricultural land exempt under Resolution 009-142. This is my property, entirely. And you're standing 10 feet inside the boundary, not 3. I could see the man with the clipboard shifting uneasily. "Karen," he said, "maybe we should verify the documents before. We have every right to ensure the neighborhood remains safe and compliant," she cut in sharply. Then she turned to me again. "If you have an issue with our presence, perhaps you should attend our open board meeting next Thursday." The invitation was sent. "I threw it in the burn barrel," I said. "Like every other notice you people send." Her nostrils flared, but she kept smiling. I pulled out my phone again. "I'm going to need all of you to leave. Immediately. You've been warned. I've got the footage from yesterday. This is your second violation." The woman with the measuring tape was already walking back to the SUV. The man hesitated, then followed. Karen stood her ground a few seconds longer, just long enough to glare at the bulls on the far side of the field, calm today, but watching. "What's the name of that one?" she asked, pointing toward Diesel. "The big one." "Diesel. Figures," she muttered. Then she turned and walked away. They backed the SUV out slower this time. I stood there until the taillights disappeared. By the time I got back to the barn, my hands were shaking. I wasn't scared, but I knew how these things escalated. Karen wasn't stupid, entitled, arrogant maybe, but not stupid. She was testing me, pushing bit by bit, waiting for me to crack or overreact. Then she'd have something to weaponize. That night, I looked up every document I had on file. County maps, HOA exemption letters, old correspondences with the zoning office. I even reached out to my lawyer friend from my Army days, Lou, who now worked in real estate law out of Tallahassee. Sent him the videos, asked for his take. His text came back just before midnight. She's in clear violation. You've got a solid case. Don't escalate. Just document everything. And if she crosses the line again, literally call the sheriff. Not local, go county. I stared at that last line. Not local. He was right. Our local precinct had always played softball with the HOA they donated to the same pancake breakfasts, sat on the same school boards. If it came down to it, I'd have to go higher, just like the old days. I shut off my phone and walked out onto the porch. The wind was picking up. Storm clouds forming over the ridge. The bulls were restless again. A low rumble of thunder echoed somewhere far off. I had a gut feeling Karen wasn't finished yet. The storm rolled in heavier than I'd expected. By morning, the sky hung low with a damp gray that pressed down on the barn roof and settled into my joints. Rain had turned the southern pasture into a shallow soup of mud and trampled grass, and even the bulls looked irritated, their snouts caked in wet earth, their massive bodies slick and restless. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window staring out at the fence line like it owed me an explanation. Karen's visit yesterday had shaken something loose, not fear exactly. Just the bone-deep knowing that trouble was circling closer than before. I knew my boundaries, literally. The fence surrounding the property had been surveyed 3 times twice during purchase, and once again after the death of my wife, when I updated the land title in my name alone. Every post was right where it was supposed to be. I'd poured the concrete footings myself. My fence didn't sag, it didn't lean, and it damn sure didn't encroach on anybody else's land. But that never stopped people like Karen. To them, fence was never just a boundary, it was a challenge. Around 10 that morning, I headed down to the south line to inspect the paddock. I brought Buck and Diesel in early, worried they'd slip in the mud or take offense to a raccoon and charge the fence. They weren't predictable animals when the weather soured. Neither was Karen. I took my time walking the fence, checking each board, every wire. Everything was in order, no signs of rot. No warping, all within my property. The bulls had their own gate reinforced and double-latched, the fencing around it bolted into steel posts driven 4 feet deep. As I worked, I noticed movement on the other side of the property line, just beyond the trees where the subdivision began. A woman in yoga pants and a raincoat stood on her patio with her phone clearly recording me. I didn't wave. She didn't either. I'd seen her before, Mrs. Tillman, I think. Friend of Karen's, HOA board secretary, if I remembered correctly. The kind who wrote passive-aggressive newsletters about lawn heights and holiday decorations. I ignored her, but within the hour, the HOA's community app had lit up. My neighbor Jason, the one decent guy left over there, texted me a screenshot. Farmer with bulls is inspecting perimeter again last night. The animals were dangerously close to the shared fence. Concerned for pets and children. Below it, Karen's comment. Taking appropriate measures. If the situation persists, HOA will involve county animal control. Animal control. I nearly spit my coffee. They were calling my bulls a situation. I threw on my coat and headed back outside. This time I brought my drone. One of my quieter hobbies since retirement, nothing fancy but good enough to map the whole property and verify fence lines to within inches. Up it went, buzzing softly above the treetops, gliding over the mud-slicked pasture and zooming in on the fence edges. I recorded the footage directly to an SD card and flew it back after 20 minutes. Not a single frame showed any bull outside the fence. Not a hoof print. Not a shadow. Still, I knew how they operated. Karen wasn't trying to prove my animals were dangerous. She was laying the groundwork to make me look like a threat, an unstable, reclusive landowner endangering the community. She wanted to build a case, and if she couldn't do it with law, she'd try to do it with fear. I wasn't about to let her. That afternoon, I dropped by the county recorder's office. It's a small building tucked behind the courthouse with beige linoleum floors and that dry paper smell that makes you think of tax returns and forgotten wills. I spoke to Clara, an old friend of mine, who worked the front desk. Still having HOA problems, she asked with a half smile. Bulls this time, I said. They're trying to say I'm in violation of the perimeter fence. Clara shook her head and pulled up my parcel ID. Nothing's changed on the books since 2009, she said. Your exemption is still active. You're zoned rural residential. HOA has no right to enforce anything here. The drainage easement stops 60 feet short of your barn. And no, they can't step onto your land. I exhaled, mind printing me all of it. She did. I left with a stack of certified records, easement maps, exemption clauses, zoning clearances, everything I could possibly need. I slid them into a weatherproof folder and stuck it in my truck's glove compartment. Let Karen try. When I got back to the farm, something felt off. The bulls were pacing again. Diesel let out a sharp bellow when he saw me. Not fear. Agitation. I walked the perimeter once more, and there it was. Fresh tire marks in the mud, right up to the edge of the southern pasture. Not on the gravel road, not on any public easement. They'd driven up here again, and this time, they were careful not to leave the vehicle visible from the house. But Diesel had seen, and Diesel didn't forget. I placed a motion-triggered game cam in the oak tree facing the fence, then another one near the gate. Silent eyes ready to catch whatever snake slithered back in. At dusk, the sky turned bruised purple. The wind picked up again, and I stood by the fence staring out into the darkening woods beyond the property line. I wasn't waiting for Karen. I was waiting for her next mistake, and I knew it was coming. 2 days passed without a sign of Karen. The skies cleared and the land began to dry. I used the time to reinforce the east gate with new hardware and moved the trail cams into better positions, higher up, angled down, concealed under pine boughs. The bulls settled down again, as if they sensed the lull in pressure, and I allowed myself a few hours of quiet to think, to breathe. But peace around here never lasted long. It was Thursday morning when the storm returned, not in the sky, but in the form of Karen's SUV, followed closely by another vehicle I didn't recognize. A dark blue sedan with vanity plates that read Board 2. The second car parked just beyond the tree line on the HOA side of the boundary. The SUV, though hers, came creeping up the same rut-worn path that had become her preferred route of invasion. I saw them from the kitchen window. Karen stepped out dressed like she was going on a safari. Wide-brimmed hat, utility vest, sunglasses. She was joined by a man and a woman I hadn't seen before. Both wore name tags. Both carried clipboards. HOA brass, I assumed. Reinforcements. I grabbed my phone, turned the camera on, and stepped out onto the porch. Morning, I called. Back again. Karen looked over, all sweetness on the surface. Mr. Lawton, she replied. We're conducting a documented inspection per our updated visual impact review for edge properties. There's nothing to inspect, I said, walking toward them. You're off your property. Again. The man, short, balding, stiff in the shoulders, spoke up. We're from the HOA Regulatory Committee. This won't take long. I stepped in front of the gate. Unless you have a warrant or written county approval to enter private land, this inspection's over. Karen gave a tight laugh. We're not breaking any laws. We're well within our rights to review adjacent properties for compliance trends. Compliance trends, I echoed. This isn't a commercial lot. This is a farm. Agricultural zone. Not under HOA jurisdiction. You're not entitled to review anything over here. The woman took a step forward, her heels sinking slightly into the still soft soil. Our members have submitted formal complaints regarding noise, animal scent, and visual pollution, particularly from your fencing debris piles and outbuildings. We're obligated to investigate. I took a step forward, keeping my voice even. Do you see that sign? I pointed to the bold red lettering on the gate again. Private property. No trespassing. This is your last warning. I've got every visit recorded, including the one where Karen walked in here without permission. Now leave. They hesitated. That's when Diesel bellowed from the pasture, long and deep and angry. They all jumped. Karen turned toward the sound, and I saw it, the flicker of fear in her eyes. Not just annoyance. Not just frustration. Fear. We need photographic documentation of the fence damage, the man said, trying to recover. There is no fence damage, I replied. And you're not getting a single photo from this side of the property line. Karen crossed her arms. You're being deliberately uncooperative. If you have nothing to hide, why so defensive? I stepped aside just enough for them to see the cameras mounted on the tree trunks, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Because when people keep breaking into my land without cause, I start defending myself with facts, footage, and force of law. The group finally began to retreat. Karen lingered a moment longer, staring out across the pasture toward the barn. Diesel let out another grunt from the distance. He was pacing again. Even from this far, I could see it. He remembered her, and he didn't like her presence. Karen muttered, We'll escalate this. I hope you do, I replied. Maybe then the county will take a good look at how many times your board has crossed the line. literally. They left without another word. But I didn't go back inside. I stood there at the fence until their vehicles disappeared back through the trees, tires throwing up bits of dried mud along the HOA's precious paved paths. That afternoon, I filed a formal trespass warning with the county sheriff's department. I sent in the photos, the video, and the documentation from Clara at the records office. I didn't want to make noise, but I wasn't about to let them twist the narrative. Because that's what Karen did best. She weaponized perception. To her, I was the unpredictable loner with bulls fences and visual pollution. She wanted to paint me as a threat so she could tighten her grip on the borderlands of the HOA. But she didn't know that I'd fought bigger wars than this. She didn't know that I'd learned patience in combat. And she sure didn't know that Diesel had a memory like an elephant and a rage like a thunderclap. I spent the evening repairing one of the side gates, not because it was broken, but because it gave me something to do. I could feel the wind shifting. Not the weather, the story. Karen had brought backup today. That meant she was preparing something bigger. I just didn't know she'd step over the line again so soon. And next time, she wouldn't walk away with just a warning. The next morning, the air was sharp with tension, before the sun even lifted the haze off the pasture. Something about the quiet felt wrong. Not the peaceful kind, but the coiled stillness before a storm breaks. Even the birds seemed hesitant. I was in the barn by 6, finishing the morning feed, when Buck's deep bellow echoed off the ridge. It wasn't his usual call. It was a warning, short, loud, guttural. Diesel followed a second later, snorting so hard it sounded like a truck's exhaust. I stepped outside. At first, I didn't see anything. But then I heard it, the dull crunch of tires on soft gravel, moving slow, cautious. Then, just like before, the white SUV appeared at the bottom of the service road. Only this time, it didn't stop near the gate. It kept going. I froze. There was no hesitation, no clipboard, no camera. Karen had driven into the pasture road. She bypassed the main gate entirely and nudged her vehicle past the split rail section near the creek, an area I hadn't thought to barricade, because no sane person would ever try to drive through it. But there she was, tires sloshing through half-dried mud, and cow tracks inching deeper onto my property, like she owned it. My heart thundered. Diesel and Buck were already alert. They stood in the far end of the field, muscles rigid, tails stiff. They hadn't moved yet, but they were watching. Karen's SUV paused about 30 feet from the reinforced gate of the southern pasture. The bulls were behind that fence for now. But I knew my animals. That gate had been latched earlier, but with the mud and last night's wind, sometimes it didn't set right. I broke into a jog across the field, my boots sucking into the damp ground with every step. "Stop the car," I yelled. Karen didn't. She opened her door and stepped out, heels sinking into the muck phone in hand, holding it up like a badge. "I'm taking evidence of livestock code violations," she shouted. "The stench from here is overwhelming." "You're trespassing," I roared. "Get back in the car!" Too late. Diesel let out a roar. I looked to the gate. Open. Just a crack, but open. The wind had blown it loose. The latch hadn't caught. I saw it in Karen's eyes the moment she realized something was wrong. Her self-righteous confidence evaporated into panic as the two bulls began a slow, deliberate walk toward her. Not a stampede, not yet. But you don't need a stampede when each animal weighs over 2,000 pounds. "Get in the car," I screamed. She fumbled, dropped her phone, dove halfway into the front seat, slammed the door, and gunned the engine. The wheels spun uselessly, kicking up wet earth, flinging chunks of mud into the air like fireworks. Diesel began to trot. Then Buck followed. That was all it took. In seconds, they were charging. Karen's SUV jerked forward, tires finally catching grip, but she turned too hard. Her front wheel smacked against a buried root, bounced, and sent the vehicle at an angle toward the fence. The bulls were already closing in, snorting bellowing foam flying from their mouths. And then it happened. Diesel hit the rear passenger panel first, shoulder first, a full-force slam like a freight train. The SUV rocked violently, the metal caving inward with a sickening crunch. Karen's scream tore through the air as Buck hit second, his horns, grazing the front panel, knocking the bumper clean off. The vehicle lurched sideways into the fence wooden posts, splintering beneath its weight. She hit the horn, frantic and useless. I ran as fast as I could, waving my arms, shouting, trying to distract them, to redirect the bulls. They weren't attacking her. They were attacking the noise, the movement, the trespass. "Back, Diesel, back." Miraculously, Diesel stopped short of the second hit. He wheeled around, snorting, kicking up dirt like a warning. Buck followed suit. They both backed off, just barely, still puffed up, eyes wide but unwilling to cross the full line into carnage. Karen sat in the driver's seat, frozen. Her windshield was cracked. The side of the SUV looked like it had been mauled by giants. One of her mirrors dangled by a thread of plastic. She didn't even try to get out. I opened the back gate and slowly led the bulls into the adjacent paddock using a grain bucket and calm words. It took 5 minutes before I was sure they were settled. Then I walked back toward the wreckage. Karen finally opened her window a crack. You have monsters on your land, she hissed. You drove into their pasture, I replied, voice low controlled. There are 6 no trespassing signs between here and the last gate. I warned you. You're going to pay for this, she snapped, fumbling for her phone, only to remember she'd dropped it outside in the mud. I think your insurance will handle that, I said, assuming they don't drop you for gross negligence. She screamed then, not words, just rage, and slammed her hand against the steering wheel. Her car horn blared like an alarm. I pulled out my phone and hit record. This is private property, I said clearly. You trespassed. I told you to leave. You crossed into a livestock area and you caused the damage. She shouted something about legal action, about animal control, about having me arrested. But I'd already called the sheriff. And this time I didn't call the local boys. I called county. They arrived 20 minutes later. Karen tried to twist the story, but I had video. I had timestamps. I had cameras. I had tire tracks. I had everything. The deputy's expression barely changed as she ranted. When she paused to breathe, he looked at me and asked, You got property documents? Glove box, I said. Certified copies. He walked to my truck and retrieved the folder. Flipped through the pages. Then he looked back at Karen. Ma'am, he said flatly, you're lucky you weren't killed. Her face blanched. The deputy pointed to the destroyed section of fence. That damage is on you. This man warned you multiple times. He has it on record. If you try to file anything against him, we'll refer the case to the DA with trespassing and reckless endangerment charges on you. Karen didn't speak, didn't blink. She just sat there as her SUV hissed, dented and steaming in the mud. As they towed her vehicle out, I stood quietly by the pasture gate, one hand resting on the fence post. Diesel stood beside me, silent and calm now, like the storm had passed. But it hadn't, because I knew Karen. And she wasn't done yet. The next day, Karen's SUV was gone, hauled off the field by a flatbed tow truck just after dawn. The damage was worse than I'd first realized. The rear quarter panel was caved in, the taillights shattered, and the passenger side window spiderwebbed like a cracked egg. There were hoof prints embedded into the mud, and even a chunk of white paint left on the lower rail of the pasture gate. It looked like a war zone. And yet somehow I knew that wasn't what really bruised Karen's pride. It was the fact that the bulls hadn't even noticed her. They hadn't cared that she was HOA, or that she was carrying a clipboard, or reciting bylaw codes. They saw a threat to their land and reacted on instinct. And for once in her life, she couldn't talk her way out of it. But Karen didn't scream until after the bulls had already stepped away. Not when the SUV was hit. Not when the gate snapped. Not when the fence gave way. No. Her scream came when I walked toward her with my phone recording, calm, unshaken, and utterly prepared. That scream was primal. Not from pain, but from humiliation. And humiliation, that's what made Karen dangerous. After the county deputy left, I stayed up late watching the footage again, frame by frame, making sure every moment was archived and backed up. The lighting was murky from the overcast skies, but it was clear enough she drove past the gate through the field directly into livestock territory. I had 4 signs in frame. 4. Still, the silence from the HOA was deafening. No apology, no acknowledgement, no attempt to pay for the fence. That was when I knew something was brewing behind the scenes. It came 3 days later. I was fixing the fence when a courier truck pulled up. No markings, no uniform. Just a plain manila envelope handed off with a clipped sign here. Inside, a legal notice. Cease and desist. Accusations of negligent livestock handling, willful endangerment of a community board member, and a bizarre claim that I had trained my bulls to be territorial weapons. I laughed, out loud. Then I didn't. Because on the second page was a demand that I remove all unsecured livestock within 72 hours or face civil suit. They were serious. Karen had flipped the narrative. She wasn't just covering her tracks. She was launching a full-scale offensive. I called Lou. "This is a bluff," he said over speakerphone. "They're trying to rattle you into removing the animals so they can claim voluntary compliance. Don't bite." "She has no ground to stand on," I said. "None." But HOA legal teams don't need ground, they need noise. If they file, you're in court. Even if you win, you'll burn months in paperwork. And they know that. "What do I do?" He paused. "How badly do you want to end this?" I looked out across the pasture where Diesel and Buck stood calmly beneath the old oak. This land had been my sanctuary, my salvation. After 22 years in war zones, I came here to stop fighting. But now I could feel the same tightening in my chest I'd felt when the first mortar dropped in Kandahar. "Badly," I said. "Then you need to flip the script," Lou said. "Make her the aggressor again. Catch her in something bigger. Bigger than bulls crushing her Lexus. Much bigger." It didn't take long. 2 days later, I got a call from Jason, my friend in the HOA, who still had a conscience. "Listen," he whispered. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but Karen's planning a community walkthrough Sunday morning. Says it's to collect visual evidence of code violations. She's getting the board members to walk the edge of your fence again. With cameras, probably. Anyone from the county invited? No. But she said she's filing an incident report in advance in case he gets aggressive." "That's you, by the way." I thanked him, hung up, stared out at the fence. If she wanted to cross the line again, good. This time I'd be ready. Sunday came fast. I spent Saturday night prepping. I reinforced the gate twice, installed 2 more trail cameras, and then I brought out the big tool, a portable military-grade motion sensor kit left over from a tactical training program I'd helped with in Texas. Perfectly legal. Perfectly invisible. The sun rose slow over the eastern ridge, burning through the mist. And then they arrived. 5 of them. Karen dressed in all white like some avenging angel of lawn regulations. Her assistant clipboard in hand. 2 board members trailing like shadows. And a man I didn't recognize, tall, quiet, holding a handheld camcorder. They didn't ring the bell. They didn't announce themselves. They just began walking the edge of the fence line, snapping photos, talking loudly to each other as if narrating for an imaginary jury. "This area shows clear signs of rot," Karen said near the old gatepost. "This pile of feed bags violates visual compliance zone B," the assistant replied. They hadn't crossed the line yet, but they were close, 5 feet, 4 feet. And then Karen stepped over. Just a little. Just enough. Snap. The motion sensor blinked red, and I stepped out from the barn with a smile. "Smile for the camera," I said. "You just broke a cease and desist order." She froze. Her assistant turned pale. "You're being recorded, Karen. And not just by me. My lawyer has live time-stamped alerts from 3 surveillance systems, and we're streaming to a cloud server that'll forward to the sheriff's office in 10 minutes. She stammered. "We were invited. This is a community. This is private land I cut in. Your notice claimed I was a danger. But I haven't left my fence. You just stepped inside it. Again." Silence. I looked at the tall man with the camcorder. "You with them?" "No, sir," he said. "I'm independent. HOA hired me for documentation. I've got all of it on tape." Karen turned on him. "You're not authorized to share that." "I'm not deleting anything," he said calmly. "You signed a waiver." She screamed again then. Not out of fear, but because the wall she'd built to control the story had just collapsed. Karen was shaking. The scream still echoed in the trees behind her, bouncing off fence posts and branches like the final shriek of a crumbling ego. Her face flushed, crimson teeth clenched, nostrils flaring. She looked less like a woman and more like a steam engine seconds from explosion. But I didn't flinch. Not this time. I stood firm at the edge of my pasture, arms folded across my chest, camera still rolling in my hand. The bulls behind me watched through the fence, calm and still. Diesel huffed once, just once, but it was enough to make one of the board members flinch. Karen spun on the videographer. "You delete that footage right now, or I'll sue you for breach of contract." The man didn't even blink. "You signed a release," he repeated. "It's a standard clause. You requested a public inspection for the HOA record. You didn't specify editing rights. This belongs to the association and my own records until otherwise contested in court." Karen's jaw dropped open and stayed there soundless for once. Her assistant looked like she wanted to sink into the dirt. "You've got 5 minutes," I said calmly, "before the county deputy arrives. That's how long it takes from the station. I already called and logged the violation. Your team set foot on private land without permission again. That's trespassing. And this time it's not a misunderstanding. One of the board members muttered something about calling their attorney. Please do, I said. I'll be waiting. Karen's eyes darted toward the gate. She looked ready to bolt. But just then, a set of tires crunched onto my front driveway, the kind of confident, weighty crunch that only a government-issued SUV can make. Lights on. Decals clean and unmistakable. County Sheriff. Deputy Marks stepped out. I knew him well enough. Not a buddy, not someone I went fishing with, but the kind of man who respected land property lines and clear rules. He nodded at me first. Mr. Lawton, he said. Got your message. You say they crossed again. I stepped aside and gestured to the red blinking motion sensor still mounted under the pine limb. They stepped 6 feet onto my land at 9:12 a.m. I've got it on camera, with live motion sensor logs time-stamped by 2 cloud backups. The guy with the camera can confirm. The videographer gave a hesitant thumbs up. I'm not part of this. Deputy Marks turned to Karen. Ma'am, is that true? She straightened her back. We were conducting a necessary safety inspection in response to community concerns. Did you have permission to enter Mr. Lawton's property? We assumed. That's a no, the deputy interrupted. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. I've already submitted formal complaints, she snapped. This man has dangerous animals. He allows bulls to charge at visitors. He's trained them like weapons. I was nearly killed on this property. Deputy Marks turned to me. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. I've got footage of the SUV incident. She drove into a livestock pasture past 4 signs. She was never attacked. She spooked the animals, panicked, and crashed into the fence. I called that in too. I saw that report, the deputy nodded. And the body cam from that day supports your account. Insurance confirmed the car damage came from animal impact after. The vehicle entered the field. Karen shrieked. He's manipulating everything. That's when something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in certainty. I took 2 steps forward and looked her in the eye. You've stood on my land. You've lied about it. You filmed me, accused me, insulted my animals, tried to twist public perception, and now you're claiming I've turned bulls into weapons. You know what I have done, Karen. I've kept to myself. I've built my fences, paid my taxes. I've cared for this land every damn day since my wife passed, and you walked into my grief like it was your front yard. Everyone went quiet. Even the wind stilled. Deputy Marks cleared his throat. I'm going to recommend that the HOA cease all physical inspections involving Mr. Lawton's property immediately. Continued trespass will escalate to criminal charges. You've been warned enough. Karen tried to protest, but he raised a hand. I've got 5 witness statements from neighbors confirming your entrance. You're lucky Mr. Lawton's being civil. Anyone else would have pressed charges already. He turned to me. You want to file a formal incident report now, or wait until the city attorney opens Monday? Monday's fine, I said. Let them bury themselves a little deeper. Karen looked like she might cry or explode. Probably both. But she didn't say another word. The board members backed away like rats from a sinking ship, quietly murmuring about schedules and meetings. Even her assistant disappeared behind the others, eyes locked on the ground. The videographer nodded to me as he left. You handled that better than most. I didn't answer. I was too busy watching Karen. She climbed into her car and slammed the door so hard, I thought the glass would shatter again. As she reversed down my driveway, I caught one last look at her face, tight with rage, bitter with embarrassment, but behind it all, something else. Defeat. The next day, an official letter arrived from the HOA. A formal apology, signed by 3 board members, not including Karen. It included confirmation that all inspections involving my property were suspended indefinitely, and that the HOA recognized my exemption status per County Resolution 09-142. They even offered to contribute toward repairs on my southern fence. I didn't take the money, but I kept the letter. You never know when the wind might shift again. The morning after I received the HOA's formal letter, I sat on the porch with a thermos of black coffee watching the fog lift from the pasture like steam rising from a battle-scarred field. It was peaceful again, almost eerily so. Diesel and Buck were back to their lazy grazing tails, flicking massive forms, casting long shadows over the earth that had once rattled with Karen's SUV tires. But peace, I'd learned, was never permanent, especially not when you'd embarrassed someone like Karen. I had no doubt she was still working the angles behind closed doors, stirring whispers into strategy, hoping she could salvage her control without dirtying her hands again. That was her way. When brute force didn't work, she turned to politics, spin, influence. Unfortunately for her, I knew how to counter both. I called Lou that afternoon, told him everything: the letter, the silence, the offer to pay for the fence. They're retreating, he said. They'll keep their heads down for a while. But Karen, she won't stay buried. She's too proud. She's also too exposed, Lou replied. You've got footage of every violation. You've got timestamps, reports, neighbor witnesses, sheriff logs. Hell, you've got more documentation than most civil cases. So what do I do with it? I asked, already knowing the answer. You build a wall with it. Not a literal one, a legal one. Something she can't breach. And that's what I did. For the next week, I gathered every shred of evidence, every video, every photograph. I compiled it all into folders, digitally and physically, meticulously labeled, time-stamped, backed up 3 times. I wrote a formal affidavit detailing each incident in chronological order. The first trespass, the inspection with backup, the bulls and the SUV, the cease and desist she violated, the false accusations she made to the HOA board and to animal control. Everything. Then I drove down to the county building with 2 copies and handed them to the administrative clerk for official filing. While I was there, I made one more stop: planning and zoning. I asked to speak with Supervisor Maggie Herron, a sharp woman in her 60s, who'd worked in land management longer than most HOA boards had existed. She looked up when she saw me. Mr. Lawton, heard you've been having trouble with the neighborhood folks again. Less trouble now, I said. But I'd like to ensure they don't try this again. I handed her a copy of the HOA's letter and my exemption documents. She flipped through them, nodding slowly. I want to submit a notice for public record, I said, declaring that any future claims of HOA jurisdiction over my land are false and subject to county penalty under misuse of authority. She raised an eyebrow, going nuclear. Just building a firewall. She smiled, signed the form, and added it to the public registry. Now, if Karen tried anything again, if she so much as referenced my name in a board meeting agenda, it would trigger a county alert. I'd forced the system to work for me, not against me. But there was still one thing left to do. The footage. I'd kept it private so far, sharing only with Lou, the sheriff, and the county. But I knew others needed to see it too. Not to mock Karen, not to gloat, to warn, to show what happens when lines are crossed, literally and figuratively. So I uploaded the video compilation, cleanly edited, no commentary. Just footage. I titled it, When HOA Power Goes Too Far, A Farmer's Warning. Within 2 days, it had 38,000 views. People began commenting: farmers, veterans, suburban homeowners, even former HOA board members. The support was overwhelming. Messages came in from across the country, stories of intimidation, property threats, fines over garden beds or paint colors. Apparently, I wasn't alone. And when Karen saw it, because I knew she would, it must have burned her to the bone. Because the next time I saw her, she wasn't in a white SUV. She was in the passenger seat of a blue sedan, staring out the window while someone else drove. She didn't step onto my property. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had once stormed my pasture with legal threats and high heels. And honestly, I didn't feel triumph. I felt done. I didn't need revenge. I had my land, my peace, my bulls, my fence, my wife's old garden blooming again along the east side of the barn. What she'd tried to take wasn't just a piece of land, it was my freedom, my identity. What I'd built after a lifetime of war and loss, and she failed. Not because I shouted louder, but because I knew who I was, and I knew the law better than she did. I walked back into the barn, shutting the doors behind me. Diesel let out a lazy grunt. I gave him a pat on the flank. She won't be back, I told him. He huffed again, as if to say, she better not. The silence after Karen's final appearance wasn't the kind that comes when someone is merely embarrassed. No. This was the silence that follows a reckoning, the kind of hush you get when a room full of people suddenly realize the one making all the noise had been wrong all along. Within a week of uploading the video, local buzz turned into regional interest. I started receiving interview requests from small-town newspapers to HOA reform blogs. I declined most of them. I didn't do any of this for fame. I just wanted my land left alone. But the conversation was happening whether I liked it or not. People were watching the footage not for the drama, but for the pattern. Karen's behavior wasn't isolated. It mirrored a larger disease spreading through communities across the country, HOA boards extending their claws past what they were legally allowed to touch, often without consequence. Until now. It wasn't long before a county compliance officer reached out to me directly. "We've been reviewing your footage," she said during a brief phone call, "and we'd like to formally request a sit-down interview regarding the actions of the Oak Hills HOA board, particularly the conduct of Ms. Karen Hollings." I agreed. They met me at the local library, a neutral space with cameras, witnesses, and no barns or bulls to distract anyone. I walked in wearing jeans and boots, a collared shirt, and a folder under my arm that I'd organized with Lou's help, chronological documentation, every letter, every map, every report, and every video still that mattered. Across the table sat two officials from the County Ethics Review Board, one zoning supervisor, and a member of the legal compliance team. They weren't there to be friendly. They were there to verify. The meeting lasted 3 hours. They didn't rush, and I didn't embellish. I laid out everything: the first visit, the false claims of jurisdiction, the harassment, the trespass, the animal control threats, the incident with the SUV, the cease and desist violations, and finally the orchestrated walkthrough, with video proof of her stepping onto my land. After swearing to the board she hadn't. Every word, every frame of footage was backed by documentation. When I was done, they said thank you. They didn't promise results, but I could see it in their eyes. They already knew. That was a Wednesday. By Friday morning it started. The HOA issued a public statement. Ms. Hollings had voluntarily stepped down from her role as president of the Oak Hills Homeowners Association, citing personal stress and safety concerns. They tried to spin it like she was a martyr, overwhelmed by the hostility of rural landowners unwilling to modernize. But no one bought it. Jason, my friend in the neighborhood, texted me a screenshot from their private message board. The comments were brutal. She lied to us. He warned her over and over. I have a bull too. They're not weapons. They're animals. This whole board needs to be audited. And then the real consequences arrived. An audit was announced. County auditors would be reviewing all of the HOA's expenditures, complaint filings, enforcement actions, and code interpretations from the last 5 years. Karen's name was on dozens of them. Her signature, her claims, her unofficial enforcement visits, all under scrutiny. Lou called me that night. "You just triggered a storm, brother." I didn't even raise my voice, I replied. "No need to. You had facts. And the internet." The next week, someone mailed me a copy of the HOA's internal minutes from an emergency meeting. A full page was blacked out, but one line stood out clear. "We can no longer afford to be represented by Ms. Hollings. Legal counsel advises immediate distance." I never saw Karen again. Rumor had it she sold her house at a loss and moved out of state. One of the board members told Jason she'd tried to sue the HOA for not defending her, ironic, considering how often she'd weaponized it for herself. I didn't feel vindictive, but I did feel settled. Not just for me, but for every neighbor she'd fined for mailbox paint or threatened over holiday lights. For the elderly couple she once forced to remove their hummingbird feeders because they attracted pests. For the single mom down the street who'd cried after Karen berated her for putting up a small basketball hoop for her son. I hadn't just defended my land. I'd pulled the curtain back on an entire pattern of abuse. And once exposed to daylight, people like Karen don't survive long. Still, I took no victory laps. I got up early the next day like always. Fed the animals. Repaired a fence post Buck had leaned too hard against. Sat on the porch with my coffee watching the light spill across the pasture. That weekend, the neighborhood kids biked past the fence. One of them waved. I waved back. Jason dropped off a six-pack and some homemade chili. He didn't say much, just nodded and sat with me a while. "You ever think about running for HOA board?" he asked with a grin. I laughed. God, no. He laughed too. But the idea stuck in the back of my mind, not because I wanted power, but because I realized how rare it was for someone to fight back and win. And maybe, just maybe, someone like me needed to sit at the table, not to control others, but to remind them where the lines are. Because lines matter, especially when you build your life behind one. It was late spring when I rebuilt the last section of the southern fence, the one that had splintered under the weight of Karen's SUV and Diesel's righteous fury. The weather was warm by then, the soil dry enough to tamp posts deep and firm, and the wildflowers Nora once planted along the eastern trail had started blooming again. I worked alone that morning. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There's a certain poetry in rebuilding something that others tried to tear down. It's not about revenge or showing off, it's about reclaiming space. Not just physical space, but emotional space, mental space. The quiet that belongs to a man who's earned it. As I hammered in the last rail, Buck wandered over to the fence line and stood beside me, chewing slowly, watching. "You remember all of it, don't you?" I said to him, smiling. He blinked once and swatted a fly with his tail. Diesel followed not long after, calm as ever, and stood sentinel beside his brother. Their pasture was whole again, secure, just as it had been before all this nonsense started. But I wasn't the same. This land had always been my refuge. It saved me after the war, after losing Nora. It gave me purpose, rhythm, and roots when the rest of the world felt too loud and too shallow. But I'd learned something over the past month. Sometimes, when peace is threatened, you can't just retreat deeper into solitude. Sometimes you have to step out of it. Speak up. Draw the line not just on a map, but in the dirt with your own hands and your own will. And make it stick. Word had gotten out far beyond Oak Hills. After the audit, the county issued recommendations to neighboring HOAs about overreach and the limits of covenant authority. A few associations even revised their rules, clarifying exactly where their powers ended. Some introduced mandatory training for board members. Others instituted external oversight panels. I never expected that. I certainly didn't ask for it. But maybe that's why it happened. Because I wasn't trying to burn anything down. I was just trying to hold the line. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a community town hall. At first, I laughed and said no. Me speaking in front of people. But Lou pushed me. Jason nudged me. Even Clara from the county office said it would help others understand what to do when they're bullied by those hiding behind rules. So I went. I stood at a podium in the community center under a flickering fluorescent light and told my story, not with anger, not with dramatics, just the truth. How Karen trespassed. How she twisted the law. How the system nearly worked in her favor until I documented everything, stayed calm, and used the law better than she did. And when I finished, a man in the back raised his hand. He was older than me, wore a faded Marine Corps hat, and had a tremble in his voice. "What would you say," he asked, "to someone who's tired, who doesn't think they've got the fight in them anymore?" I looked him in the eye. "I'd say you don't need to yell to be strong. You don't need to punch to make an impact. You just need to know where your lines are and never let anyone move them for you." He nodded. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle in my chest. That wasn't tension. It was peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't come from being left alone, but from being heard. That summer, the town surprised me. They held a small dedication at the community fair. Nothing grand, just a sign painted in gold on black. In honor of Daniel Lawton for defending his land, his rights, and the dignity of rural life. I didn't cry. Not then. But when I got home and walked the edge of the pasture that evening with the sunset painting Diesel's back in gold, I felt my throat tighten. Because Nora would have been proud. She always told me, "You're not just building a farm, you're building a legacy." I thought that meant rows of corn or cattle records, or a barn that didn't leak. Turns out, legacy is just the story people tell when you're not in the room. And now my story was out there. Not as a warning, not even as a victory lap, but as proof that no matter how small or quiet a person might seem, if you stand for what's yours, if you defend it with principle and patience, you can outlast any storm, even one named Karen.